everyone, so this is the part 2 of the earlier video. Now we would be looking to the facial component. As I told you, today we would be looking to the facial component. Again, there are going to be 14 bones that are involved in the facial component. Now this skull part, the facial region, we are going to study it in various aspects, okay, in various planes. The anterior view, lateral view, then inferior and the posterior view, okay. Looking first towards the anterior view. See, in the anterior view, if you see which are the bones are being seen here, we have a frontal bone here, okay, then we have a orbital bone here, then we have nasal bones here, we have the maxilla here and the mandible here. These are the basic bones. Then this particular area here is said to be the zygomatic arch, okay. So these are the major bones which are seen in the anterior view. Certainly there are certain foramens which are seen here. This foramen here, and now this foramen here, and one foramen is this here, this one. So these are the three foramens, and you can name this as supraorbital foramen, then the infraorbital foramen, and lastly the mental foramen that is present on the mandible region, okay. So anteriorly, when you see, these are the structures which could be seen on the anterior skull. Now if we talk about the bones which are inside the orbit, like bones which are forming the orbit, or bones which are forming the nasal region, or different parts of mandible, now this is a different topic, okay. We cannot cover it in this video, otherwise it will become very long. So here we are just taking an overview of what skull looks like, okay. So this is from the anterior view. Coming to the lateral view, in the lateral view, again you can see this is the frontal bone, this is the parietal bone, this is the temporal bone, this here is your sphenoid bone, this is the zygomatic arch, the mandible, okay, the occipital bone. So these are the things which you know very well by now. Now certain different structures which we can see here, like this here, this is said to be your mastoid process, okay. This structure here is said to be the mastoid process. Then zygomatic arch, you know it very well, okay. So basically these are the bones which we can see on the lateral view. Now certain points are different here also, like the pterion, asterion, then the suprameatal or the Mc-Evans triangle. What are these structures? Now you see here, let me just highlight this point. This junction here, okay, this junction here is said to be your pterion, okay. This structure is said to be the pterion. So you can say that pterion is a structure which is basically at the junction of your frontal bone, sphenoid bone, parietal bone and the temporal bone. This particular structure is said to be your pterion. Moving ahead to what is asterion. Now this structure here, this, let me highlight this. This here is said to be your asterion, okay. Now asterion is something which is formed at the junction of the temporalis bone as well as your parietal bone as well as your occipital bone. So if we talk about pterion, it was formed by the junction of four bones: the parietal bone, frontal bone, temporalis, and the temporal bone and the sphenoidal bone. Whereas your asterion is made by the junction of these three bones, that is the parietal bone, temporal and the occipital bone. Coming to this is, you very well you know by now, this is the mastoid process. Just above the mastoid process, you will see a triangular structure which is formed here, which is not very well appreciated, but this is said to be the suprameatal triangle or the Mc-Evans triangle. Now for now, you just know that a Mc-Evans triangle is present here. What are the boundaries of this triangle or the further things are not discussed here, but in a separate video. For now, you can just know the anatomy, that just above the mastoid process there is this triangle present that is said to be the suprameatal or the Mc-Evans triangle. Now we will be looking to the posterior view. We have already discussed the posterior view on the bones aspect, but there are few things you need to see here, like what is the external occipital protuberance. See, this particular enlightened point here, which is very prominent on the skull, this is said to be the external occipital protuberance. You can also say this to be the most prominent part in the skull, okay. This is the most pointed out or the prominent part of the skull. Now coming to what are the nuchal lines. We are also going to study about the nuchal lines further, but here also for just an overview, you can see we have two nuchal lines which are said to be the superior and the inferior nuchal lines. Further in the pictures, I'll show you this more properly. For now, you can just see this. Now this external occipital protuberance at times is also said to be a structure that is inion. Inion and EOP is one and the same thing. Now coming to the inferior view. Guys, till now whatever we have studied, whether it is the cranial portion or the facial portion from other aspects, were still a easy thing. Inferior portion is a little tricky, okay, because you here are going to have bones as well as structures, and different foramens are going to be there. Okay, now it is all full of different foramens. I will try to make it as easy for you as possible. Here we are going to discuss these structures in the 2D picture. Furthermore, in 2-3 days we'll get you a video in which you can see the real foramens in the real skull. Okay, it will make you more easily understand the concept of foramens in the skull. Now looking here, firstly we are going to see the superior view of the skull here, the cranium cavity basically, and here we are going to see the inferior portion of the cranial cavity. Okay, so here we are going to see both superiorly and inferiorly. Let's first see superiorly. Superiorly, your skull could be divided into 3 parts, that is the anterior portion, the middle portion and the posterior region. Now if you know, this particular area is also said to be your sphenoid bone. Okay, this is the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and the greater wing of sphenoid bone. So this is, again we are going to study this when we will study our sphenoid bone. Okay, for now you just remember that the bone, the cranial cavity superiorly could be divided into 3 parts, the superior aspect, the middle aspect and the posterior aspect. If you see, what are the structures which are seen in the anterior aspect? Okay, in the anterior aspect we can see structures like the crista galli. Now what is crista galli? See, this center structure here, this is said to be the crista galli. Okay, next is the cribriform plate. This structure is said to be your cribriform plate. Okay, now the foramen cecum, just anterior to the cribriform plate, somewhere here is going to be the foramen cecum. These are the major structures which are seen in the anterior cranium. There are other structures as well, but for now you can just remember these parts. Okay, moving ahead to the middle portion of the cranial cavity, what are the foramens which could be seen here? Again, here we have the first, that is the optic canals. These are where the optic canals are present usually. Now what is this rose here? See here, what is this rose? This is basically a small mnemonic I've written for you to remember these 3 foramens. E is nothing here, it's just R, O and S. R here is foramen rotundum, O is for foramen ovale and S is for foramen spinosum. As I've written this in this order, they are also present in the same order. जिस तरीके से लिखा है उसी तरीके से ये present भी हैं. So remember it by this mnemonic only. You will also remember the order this way. Now this here is said to be your foramen rotundum here. Okay, the round foramen. Here you see to be the foramen ovale. It's oval in shape, very prominent, very large. This is foramen ovale. This is rotundum, and a very small spinosum foramen is there. This is very, very small, a pinpoint kind of foramen. This is, now this is said to be your foramen rotundum, ovale and spinosum here. It is a pinpoint small foramen. Okay, foramen spinosum. Now foramen lacerum. What is foramen lacerum here? I don't know if you can see it clearly in this picture, but this here is one foramen. Let me just clear this out for you. This foramen here, okay? If you see the boundaries, this one. This is your foramen lacerum. In the video when I'll be showing you the real skull, you will see these structures more prominently. Okay, then you have a superior orbital fissure. Again, superior orbital fissure is not that prominent here, but it is present somewhere here. Okay, I'll show you in the real skull soon. Now coming to the posterior cranium region, this is your posterior cranium part. What are the structures we can see here in this part is, wait a minute. What are the structures we can see here? The structures we can see here is, now this is the foramen magnum. This biggest foramen here is said to be the foramen magnum. Okay, so this is the first structure. Another structure you see here is the hypoglossal canal. Can you see this canal small here? This is your hypoglossal canal. Next we see is the jugular foramen. This here is a J shape. You can see it is a J-shaped foramen, that is the jugular foramen here and here. Lastly, we have the internal acoustic meatus. This here is the internal acoustic meatus. Of course, is not that prominently seen in this picture, but again, I'll show you in the real skull soon. Okay, these were all the structures which could be appreciated superiorly from the cranium cavity. Now we will be moving to the ones which are appreciated from the inferior aspect of the cranial cavity. Now again, you have a structure here that is said to be occipital condyles. This is your occipital condyles. Okay, just before your occipital condyle there is going to be hypoglossal canal here, which you cannot appreciate in this picture. Okay, next, just after the occipital your condyle, you have another canal, that is the condylar canal. So this is your condylar canal. Okay, next, what is a styloid process? If you see this pointed structure here, okay, this pointed structure, this is your styloid process. This is your mastoid process, which we have also seen in the lateral view. Next is the stylomastoid foramen. Just in between of the styloid process and the mastoid process, there is going to be a small foramen, which is your, this particular foramen is your stylomastoid foramen. It is forming in between of styloid process and mastoid process, so is named as your stylomastoid foramen. Next is your greater palatine foramen. On the palate, of course, here is the greater palatine foramen. Near the third molar it is present, and on the palate this is present. Okay, next, in this picture you can also see this canal here. This canal here, this is your carotid canal. Okay, this is a structure which can only be appreciated prominently from the inferior aspect. This is the your carotid canal. Okay, just after, or you can say just before the carotid canal, again here also you can see this is ovale and spinosum, जो हमने superior aspect से भी देखा था. Then this is the incisive fossa, which is here, and lastly you have the jugular foramen. This is your jugular foramen. आप ऐसे याद करना इसको कि आपका carotid canal के, wait a minute, if this is your carotid canal, just before your carotid canal you have ovale and spinosum. Just after the carotid canal you have the jugular foramen. If you talk about occipital condyles, just before the occipital condyles you have the hypoglossal canal, and just after it you have the condylar canal. Okay, this is how you have to remember it. In between of the styloid process and mastoid process, you have got the stylomastoid foramen. So this was the basic foramens and a basic overview of skull. As I have just said you, in the next video we will talk about a real skull and we will see all these structures on the real skull.